Our next speaker, Dr. Anat Plocker. Dr. Plocker holds a PhD in history, and she has taught in the University of Haifa and in the Interdisciplinary Center in Israel. She is currently a visiting professor at Stockton University. כאשר מדברים על בריחת המוחות, לצערי זה חלק מהעניין, but we do hope that things might change. Dr. Anat Plocker works focus on the post-war Eastern Europe, particularly communist Poland, looking at the place of Jews in the society and the construction of memoirs of World War II. And she is one of the brilliant scholars of Poland nowadays, and one of her work, among many others, deals with the anti-Zionist campaign in Poland, 1967 till 1968. And Anat will speak about the legacies of March 1968. We'll collect questions and comments afterwards, mainly questions more than comments, but that will be after hearing all the three speakers.
Thank you, Javi. Thank you to the organizers of today's events. So before I start, I wanted to say a couple of preliminary things. First of all, as I said, thank you. And the other thing is that I've been thinking for many years now about the questions of the memory of the Holocaust, commemoration of the Holocaust in 1968, and had many conversations about this back in the day in Warsaw with Professor Stola, with other people. So I had many conversations about these issues of memory of the Holocaust of 68, and now it seems to have all exploded in Poland. This whole connection between 68 and 2018. I remember that even here in Tel Aviv University we had, I don't know if you remember this, a conversation about this with Laura Yokosh and myself and Jan Gross about the questions, again, of memory of the Holocaust and 68 and today's Poland a few years ago. So I want to go back to these questions of March 1968 and the memory of the Holocaust and contemporary Poland. Because when we celebrated, so 10 years ago, right, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the March events. And the 40th anniversary was so different. It was a discussion of the triumph of democracy, the triumph of liberalism in Poland, right? How we have marched so far from March 68. And now it's clear that many of us and many in Poland have overlooked a certain aspect of the legacy of March 1968, the legacy of Polish nationalism and its battle for the good name of Poland. And I want to speak about these similarities between the discourse on Holocaust study, on Holocaust memory in 1968 and today. And this is a topic that, and this talk that I'm giving is constantly developing and changing including last night, as events evolve in Poland surrounding right, the Polin Museum and other questions there. And I want to say that to a large extent, and I will expand on this, of course, the contemporary Polish government is fulfilling the hopes of some of the major actors of March 1968. I want to say that Gomułka's project to Polonize Poland, to Polonize Polish history, has been taken up by today's Polish government. A fellow historian, Brian Porter, has put it nicely by saying that Władysław Gomułka was grounded in the nationalist right. So, in spite of what the Polish Prime Minister has said, that Poles in Poland were not responsible for March because Poland was under Russian control, in fact, March 1968 was a Polish project, grounded in Polish nationalism, and started in the name of Poland's future. And I want to say a few words still about the contemporary. So in 2015, we saw the peace winning, right? Law and Justice Party won both the presidential and parliamentary elections in Poland. Right? And at its helm, who stands at the helm of peace? Kaczynski, Jaroslaw Kaczynski, and he was a student, right? He was a young man in March 1968 who had seen the demonstrations, who had seen the anti-Zionist campaign unfold. He and his brother were activists, right, in the opposition to communists, and communism, and then they split ways, and I'm not going to go into the whole story. They established peace in sort of the early 2000s. And this is a party that calls for the return to traditional family Polish values. And once more, what was important at its founding was that it talked about a new reckoning with the communist past. So it started off as a party that dealt with the past already. Okay, it was talking about the more recent past, that we should rethink about how Poland has dealt with the crimes of communism. So from its inception, this was a party that wanted also to question memory. As you all know, in 2010, right, Lech Kaczynski was killed in a plane accident. Okay, and then it sent peace to a further, I'm not getting into all the details, but this sent Kaczynski, the other Kaczynski, further into a illiberal direction. And today his party promotes the idea that the state is meant to protect the Polish nation, that democracy is not a value in itself, but it has to accommodate for Poland's needs. And now a great deal of the party's agenda deals with the memory of World War II, not just communism. And it has launched several campaigns to correct the history of the war, focusing specifically recently on Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust. Right, and most recently, a scandal erupted revolving around the issue that everyone's been talking about, the Polish concentration camps. Right, so they passed the legislation making the use of the term Polish concentration camps illegal. Right, the law states that anyone who uses the term outside of an academic context can receive up to 3 years in jail or pay a fine. The law hasn't been installed yet, but it has passed in Parliament and even signed by the President, right? And the Polish Prime Minister defended this law by saying that it protects the good name of Poland from slander, and saying that the truth about World War II must be safeguarded. We saw similar legislations, and the Poles actually are not unique in this, and the law was passed with much less scandal in Ukraine, Lithuania, and Latvia, actually.
Excuse me.
No, I'm sorry, do not interrupt when I'm speaking. Questions will be in the end. This is very rude.
This is not a question. Please let her continue.
I understand Polish, and excuse me, sir, would you direct this comment to any of the men in the panel? No, you wouldn't. So
Excuse me, sir. Please listen to her. Questions with a question mark at the end will be received. Not now. She's in the middle of her paper. Please continue, Anat.
Thank you, Chloe. Okay, so as I said, these legislations seek to control the narrative of the war, right, and to present the citizens of places like Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland as victims, not as, not in a more complex way as we've been trying. So not to talk about them as perpetrators, rescuers, and victims all at the same time, but these legislations want to talk about the citizens of the formerly occupied countries as solely victims of the Nazi occupation. And they want to silence historical debates on the questions of collaboration. what I want to, and here's the point, the rhetoric, the piece, right, that we see in the newspapers, in the press, we see the government saying all of the way they're talking about this legislation is very reminiscent of the language of 67, 68. The language of contemporary nationalism and its focus on the memory of World War II is closely related to the language of their president, of exactly these Polish nationalists who operated within the communist context in the 60s and the 70s. So, like then, so today. For example, the issue of the righteous among the nations is very, very central. It was very central in 1967, 1968. In one example, one of the chief sort of propagandists of 68, Gontash, Richard Gontash, explained once in a TV interview that he was preparing a documentary that would show the truth about the help the Polish nation gave Jews, and that the movie will show that millions of Poles were righteous, not thousands. Unlike what the Israeli state had claimed, right, as part of what he called an anti-Polish campaign. He claimed that he had received tens of thousands of letters from Poles who had saved Jews. And the film that he produced indeed presented a very nationalist narrative of World War II and of rescue, a narrative that was completely unrelated to what you would think of as communist propaganda on World War II. The movie explained how Poles gave their lives for Jews. And in one of his speeches, in another example, Gomułka himself said that all Polish Jews owe their lives to Jews, that no Polish Jew had survived without the help of Jews. The Jews were ungrateful. I'm sorry, without Poles, yes, sorry. The Jews were ungrateful to the Polish nation, okay, that they would not have survived the war without the aid of Poles. And this obsession with the righteous continued throughout the anti-Zionist campaign. During, for example, National Memory Month, which was April, always in April around the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising anniversary, so always in April there was National Memory Month. And in April 68, this month the press focused on righteous among the nations. They trumpeted people who were not, of course, part of this campaign, like Bartoszewski, and used the works of people who were not part of the campaign, but they used their words, they used their works to promote the idea that Poles were the rescuers of Jews, that Poles were the only heroes and the only victims of World War II. The commemoration ceremony of the uprising in 68 also highlighted the Polish role in the Holocaust and downplayed substantially the suffering of Jews, and they pushed out the Jewish organizations who had previously participated in such events commemorating the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And today one cannot think about this when Peace has declared that it's opening a museum for the Warsaw Ghetto, with a similar agenda, that this museum is supposed to present a history of the ghetto, again, that would stress good relations and aid of Poles to Jews. Another example of this is, for example, where did the Polish Prime Minister, for example, where did he choose to have his press conference? So the Polish Prime Minister had a press conference on the issue of the Polish concentration camps legislation, and he had this press conference at the Ulma Family Museum of Poles Saving Jews. Okay, this is a museum that Peace opened. It opened in 2016. It's clear from the name, right? This is the museum dedicated to Poles saving Jews. And of course, this is part of the attempt to emphasize the roles of Polish rescuers. while rejecting, right, who are they rejecting? Roth and Grabowski and the whole school of thought that talks about Polish participation in the persecution of the Jews. The website of the museum explains that the primary goal is to show the heroic stance of Poles who helped Jews during the German occupation, risking their own lives and the lives of their families. The Ulma family themselves were a Polish family that had indeed hidden Jews during the war and was murdered by the Germans alongside the Jews they were hiding in 1944. And the main exhibition presents both their story, of course, and the stories of other rescuers in the area. Okay, and like Gontaj, the museum also claims that they were far more righteous and substantially more righteous than historians so far have claimed. Of course, this museum doesn't address the complexities of the Polish countryside during the German occupation, where Poles were victims, rescuers, and perpetrators all at the same time. So this is a narrative of the past that rejects complexity. And of course, the choice of this location for the press conference on the concentration camps legislation speaks for itself. Right? The contemporary government wants to stress the role of Poles as rescuers and victims and refuses to join the conversation on Polish collaboration, which they consider to be anti-Polish slander, just like in '68. And this brings us to the issue of concentration camps. Right? I just talked about this legislation. However, a discussion of concentration camps also existed in 1967, even before March 1968. And this revolved around a debate on an entry in the Polish Encyclopedia of 1966, an entry on death camps. And in this entry, the writers mentioned that the vast majority of those murdered in extermination camps and death camps were Jews. And in 1967, certain people in the regime, in the party, turned against the writers of this encyclopedia and said, well, this is wrong. This encyclopedia neglects to mention the suffering of Poles. And these party members insisted that the entry falsified the true history of the camps and neglected the suffering of Poles in German camps. Newspaper headlines raged against the writers of the entry, accusing them of slander against the Polish nation. During an investigation by the party in '67, the officials accused the writers of a falsification of history that played into the hands of Poland's enemies. And the party also published lengthy articles in the press, as Darius has mentioned, right? The press was all controlled by the party. So they published lengthy articles claiming that Polish suffering was much greater than Jewish suffering, that they were next in line, and moreover, that their suffering was deliberately erased from public memory, from international thinking about the Holocaust, that there was a conspiracy against Poland. And they claimed in '67, '68 that a conspiracy of Jews and West Germans was behind this anti-Polish campaign and this deliberate effort to erase Polish suffering. Today, the accusations are more vague, but of the similar nature of why Polish suffering has been erased and forgotten. And peace see themselves as the defenders of true history from falsification by Jews and Westerners. So in a similar vein to their predecessors, Gomulka's nationalists of '67, '68. And this idea, this rescuer narrative, represents, in my view, a secular reincarnation of the idea of Poland as Christ among the nations. a long-held myth of national sacrifice and victimhood. According to this myth, Poland is the bulwark of Christendom, defending Europe against the infidel. It is a nation assailed by dangerous neighbors, and it is martyred, right, as Christ for the sins of the world and resurrected for the world's salvation. You know, Poles really embraced this idea of Polish suffering that is equivalent to the suffering of Christ. That they have sacrificed so much and no one remembers this today. And this idea of Christ among the nations, sacrifice for the sake of others, corresponds with the perception of Poles as saviors of Jews and heroes of wartime Europe. This idea that rose in the 1960s and is making a huge comeback. In my concluding remarks, I want to say a couple of words. So first, we can't draw a direct line from 68, of course, to 2018. Okay, of course, there's no direct line from Gomułka to Kaczynski. We're highlighting certain aspects of similarities. And commemorative politics today have also been shaped by the events that surrounded the fall of communism and the post-communist governments and the rise of importance of Holocaust memory in the EU. These are all things that have also shaped, of course, peace politics. However, I do want to try and say something about longer trends in Polish post-war history. And I began by quoting Brian Porter, who said that Władysław Gomułka was grounded in the nationalist right. And that, and indeed Gomułka's project, and I think we can talk about a project here, was that of a Polish Poland, a homogeneous nation state. And Gomułka himself said in the 1940s, all countries are built on national principles and not multinational ones. And World War II made an aspiration, like Gomułka's aspiration of a homogeneous Poland, it had made it plausible. Okay? Without the violence of the Germans and the Soviets, right? The Polish nationalists would not have dared to think this is plausible, that we can actually fulfill the dream of Polish nationalists of having a Poland for Poles only. And this project of Poland for Poles only, if you remember, begins actually with the expulsions of Germans. Millions of Germans are expelled from the western borderlands of Poland in 45 to 46, 47. This is at the same time when the regime is very actively encouraging Jewish immigration from the country. And of course, this is also followed by the forced relocation of Ukrainians in 1947. Okay, so the national project of a homogeneous Poland doesn't end with the end of World War II, and it doesn't even end then, right? Because this continues as Gomułka returns to power. Gomułka comes back in 1956, and what does he do? He encourages once more Jewish immigration. In 56, but then again in 68. And during his more or less 15-year reign, he and the regime, they actively encouraged the immigration of minorities. Specifically Jews, of course, but also members of the German minority still living in Poland. And these efforts, right, they are very successful. And Poland today is a country that is about 97% ethnically Polish. Yeah, so we see that this national project of Gomułka was rather successful. Now, the left-leaning governments that came after the fall of communism saw this past as something that we need to come to terms with. They attempted to reconcile with neighbors. They offered apologies, if you remember, previous presidents, to Jews and to Ukrainians. There are attempts to build bridges with Germany and with the Germans who had left, who were expelled from Poland. But today's government, peace, they don't see this past as blemished. They see the national project as heroic, as necessary, as Poland, after all, was the Christ, or is Christ among the nations. Okay? And they see the previous government's views on the past as surrender to the demands of the West and the European Union. And as part of the rejection of the European project, of its identity politics and its probing of the past, and of recent works by really interesting historians to speak of World War II and of the genocide of Jews in complicated ways. So peace rejects all of that and does not want to apologize about the past. It wants to glorify it. And like the pause of 68, it wants to tell the world the truth about Poland. Thank you.